source of life and cause of death. Water can wash away clues, dilute evidence, and conceal corpses. For investigators, water can be a cunning opponent. For criminals, a most accommodating ally. For the perfect crime, just add water. Innisfil, Ontario is a bedroom community 70 kilometers north of Toronto, a quiet recreation town on the edge of Lake Simcoe. On the afternoon of April 25, 1996, a man walks along a trail at Innisfil Beach Park. He notices splashing in the water about 100 meters from the shore. In the distance, a red canoe drifts away. He suddenly sees someone in danger of drowning, clinging desperately to a floating patch of ice. He calls for help. At first glance, this seems like an unfortunate end to a simple canoe ride on Lake Simcoe. However, appearances can be deceiving. Will investigators find they are piecing together a series of tragic errors made by a calculating mind?
It's unusual to have someone out on the lake at that time of year when the ice is still so close to the shore.
15 minutes after receiving the 911 call, Innisfil Fire Rescue arrives at Alcona Park. Their rescue boat is still stored for the winter, so the paramedics must get to the victim in a rowboat.
The water temperature at the time was 4 degrees Celsius, and there was still ice out on the lake.
The rescuers reached the man nearly 45 minutes after the 911 call was placed. He is severely hypothermic and unable to speak.
One of the fire rescuers at the scene actually asked him to blink once for no, twice for yes. Was there anyone in the canoe with you? And he didn't respond.
There are no signs of any other victims, so they return to shore. Alive but unresponsive, the man is rushed to the Royal Victoria Hospital in nearby Barrie, Ontario. Rescuers identify the victim as Winston Malcolm and find his address. The fire rescue team briefs Innisfil Police with the victim's name and the few details they have of the incident. Officers then pay a visit to Mr. Malcolm's home to notify any relatives.
They went to the residence to notify Jan that Winston had been in this situation. She wasn't home, and that caused them some concern.
Several hours later, Winston begins to regain consciousness in the hospital. In a delirious state, he calls for his wife, Jan Marshall. He asks the nurse if Jan is alive. Knowing that Winston was brought in alone, the nurse immediately contacts police.
He indicated that he and his wife went out for a canoe trip just to practice their skills, and that his wife was laying in the bottom of the canoe because she was cold. She was covered up with a sleeping bag, and they paddled back and forth. And at one point, they became lodged on some ice. They both tried to extricate themselves by use of the paddles, pushing off on the ice floe, at which time the canoe capsized, throwing them both into the water.
Police already know there was nobody home at Mr. Malcolm's house. They fear Jan Marshall might still be at the lake. That same evening, police and fire rescue return to search Lake Simcoe. They scan the water and the shoreline at Alcona Beach Park where Winston was found. There is no sign of Jan Marshall. Darkness falls and the search is called off until morning.
It was a missing person case. Had she made it to shore? Was she somewhere along shore? Had she succumbed to the water and drowned? They had no idea.
The following morning, on April 26th, Detective Inspector Ron Gentle coordinates a recovery team. He calls in the Ontario Provincial Police dive unit to begin searching for the body of Jan Marshall.
At the time, I was approximately 4 hours away, so it took a good portion of the day to pack up and to respond to the call.
Detective Sergeant Tom McDonald dispatches officers to attend the scene and question witnesses.
We had several witnesses from shore who saw the gentleman in the canoe. Starting at approximately 11 o'clock in the morning, he was observed. And throughout the course of the day, right up until the time that the canoe capsized at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon.
It appeared that the canoeist was paddling just up and down along the ice, and as it would slowly move out, he kept paddling just up and down, going into deeper and deeper water as the ice floe moved out. None of the witnesses, and I think there were 6 or 7, that watched from time to time from shore, saw the canoe on the ice, saw the canoe in distress. You know, they saw him and only he. They never saw Jan. They thought there was just one person in the canoe.
Suspicions arise as the hope of finding Jan Marshall alive begins to fade. Dead or alive, she must be found in order for the investigation to proceed.
We were told our inspector was going to be attending the scene because there was rather some suspicion of foul play. Just accumulation of the time of year, being out in a canoe with the ice still on the water, and the flags were up. So that's, I think, when we first thought that we're going to be a little more prudent with the collection of evidence on this one. We just were given a primary target location, and we went out and searched it.
The dive team starts from the public dock at Alcona Beach. The initial search area is 100 by 150 meters, and the water temperature is 4 degrees Celsius. The divers use a technique called sledding, which allows them to search a large area of the frigid lake very quickly.
We dive in pairs, so basically 2 planing boards, a diver on each board being pulled with the vessel making way. It's attached with rope to the back of the boat, and the divers can manipulate the board, tilt it up if they want to go up, tilt down, sideways. It's, you know, the versatility of the board. You can do anything you want. Communicate with the boat operator if you want to speed up or slow down. And we cover such a large area using the sleds. In this lake, Lake Simcoe, the visibility was 15 feet. So with 2 divers, you're covering a good swath, at least a 20-foot swath with the sleds.
The divers come up empty-handed.
The ice would come in closer to shore some days, and the wind would blow it out further. So we didn't have a specific search area, and so we did the best we could with what the information we had at the time.
There's very few reference points when you look out into the water. You can't say, you know, it's right next to that telephone pole. It's 300 yards out, and you know, you go which way a couple degrees, and you could be talking, you know, hundreds of feet.
There's just enough time for one more dive before darkness forces the team to stop. Will they find the body of Jan Marshall? In April 1996, a man is rescued from Lake Simcoe, Ontario. His canoe had capsized, leaving him hypothermic in the frigid waters and unable to speak. Several hours after being admitted to the hospital, he informs a nurse that his common-law wife, Jan, was also in the canoe. Divers from the Ontario Provincial Police have been called in to assist the search. They do 2 dives on the first day.
The first day, we just were given a primary target location, and we went out and searched it, and there was no luck in locating any debris from the capsized canoe or the victim.
On April 27th, the underwater search resumes, this time more intensely with an expanded search area.
were equipped with wireless communications. So the divers had the ability to communicate with each other as well as communicating with the boat operator. And so we just took turns rotating through the cycle of diving. And the water depths out there, they didn't exceed 35 feet. We didn't have the tools of the GPS at the time in '96, so we physically went out and we placed markers. And the boat operator, he's got an area to maintain. It's some, whether you want to call it a Zamboni style of searching, they just eliminate certain areas and just expand from there.
Meanwhile, investigators talk with members of Jan's family.
She'd actually been out to BC to visit her mother just weeks prior. Had told her mother that she was considering moving out to BC and leaving Winston.
Could this suggest a possible motive for Jan's disappearance? Investigators look for more clues by comparing witness statements to those of Winston Malcolm. Winston's first statement is about why he and Jan were canoeing on icy Lake Simcoe at that time of year.
The reason that he provided for being on a lake was that he had a upcoming canoe trip planned in Algonquin Park for the May 2nd weekend. He indicated that he and his wife went out for a canoe trip just to practice their skills.
The story Mr. Malcolm gave us was that he lowered the canoe onto the car and she walked ahead, and he picked her up en route. And when he picked her up, she complained about being chilly. And he unloaded the canoe at the waterfront, put it in the water, and she laid in the canoe, and he went and parked the car. He came back and put a sleeping bag over top of her, and then he pushed off and he paddled, as she didn't paddle at all. Now, I'm not an avid canoeist, but I'm an outdoors person, and I have canoed. And I can't imagine somebody laying in the bottom of an uninsulated canoe if you're chilled. I just find that would be a little cold. And her family were able to tell us that she had just recovered from pneumonia. She suffered late in the winter as well. So those two facts didn't make a whole lot of sense to us as well.
But none of the witnesses saw Jan at the scene. Is it possible that she never got into the canoe in the first place?
Witnesses from the shore said the canoe was sitting steady in the water, even. Whereas if you have a 200-plus pound man and a woman at the back of the canoe, because he described her laying in the bottom with her head on his knees, one would think the canoe would be tipped, obviously, to the rear, and nobody saw that. So the displacement that was described by the witnesses on shore and the positioning of the two bodies in the canoe, as he described, didn't make any sense as well.
Curiously, the witnesses did not actually see the canoe capsize. In two separate statements made to the police about the accident, Winston contradicts himself.
He gave two versions once again. One was that they got hung up on the ice, that he paddled onto the ice and asked her to help shove off, and that the two of them shoved off from the same side and the canoe capsized. And another version is that she got up to paddle and somehow off-balanced the canoe. So once again, it goes back to his statements. None of the witnesses, and I think there were 6 or 7, that watched from time to time from shore, saw the canoe on the ice, saw the canoe in distress. They saw him and only he. They never saw Jan. They thought there was just one person in the canoe.
On the second day of the search, the dive team conducts 2 more unsuccessful dives. They are desperate to pinpoint the location where the canoe capsized. That same day, Winston is released from the hospital. Officers then pay a visit to ask him for help to find Jan.
We asked if he could return to the site, and it would greatly assist our search if he could come out in the boat, in the vessel, and give us a location where he suspected it occurred.
The team does their third and final dive of the day. But once again, the frigid water of Lake Simcoe refuses to divulge its secret.
Depending on the length of time that he was in the water, the survivor, he could have drifted quite a ways. Lake Simcoe is a large area, body of water, and he could drift quite a ways with the wind and the wave action. And he put us out in left field, totally out of the picture. But that was the area he identified. So our third dive that day, we searched it and there was nothing.
The detectives begin to speculate. Was Winston's memory of the accident blurred, or did he intentionally put them on the wrong track? The dive team will spend one more day searching for Jan Marshall. To maximize their chances of finding her body, they turn to an unlikely source for help. The canoe that Winston Malcolm was paddling capsized on Lake Simcoe, Ontario. Rescuers managed to save him, but there is still no sign of his common-law wife, Jan Marshall. By this point, suspicions run high, but investigators still do not have enough evidence to know if they are dealing with an accident or a crime. On April 28th, the OPP dive team prepares for a third day of searching for Jan's body, but they struggle to find the spot where Winston capsized his canoe.
Yeah, we had aerial photographs of the shoreline, and we tried as best we could to pinpoint where the body was located, or where the mishap had occurred as far as the capsizing of the canoe. We even considered using, at one point, satellite images.
The dive team turns to the local news media that covered Winston's rescue. They hope something was captured on videotape.
The information came forward that when the fire department were out making the rescue, there was a cameraman on shore with the local television network. So we were able to track down the video that he took, the footage, plus the cameraman himself. He attended the scene and he was able to give us the exact location where he was standing, and the shot that he took communicated with a boat that was out on the water. We directed them into the location and they dropped a marker, and then we concentrated around that marker.
The dive team finally has a precise idea as to where they should look. Will they find the victim?
And on the third day, we conducted the first dive. And 15 minutes into the dive, we located the victim. The victim was lying on her left side she was wearing a dark-colored bomber-style jacket. It was up over her head. She was wearing brown pants with light-colored socks. She had no footwear, which was in itself suspicious. There was a coil of rope suspended above her, and it appeared to be looped through her belt loop on the back of her pants. And her hands were free. There was nothing in her hands. Once she was located, I placed our pelican marker, which was just a weight. I tied it to her right ankle, and the marker surfaced. I followed the marker to the surface, making sure that it was unraveling all the way up, and notified the members in the boat of my discovery. And I was also informed then that my partner, Larry Scott, had located a patio stone.
The dive team feels a sense of relief, both for Jan Marshall's family and for the detectives who can now proceed with the investigation.
They came up to the surface and notified us, and we asked them, when they came back and briefed us, to take the video equipment down and to film the scene, because it was our body recovery scene. And that is usually one of the largest pieces of evidence we have in any investigation, any death investigation.
Well, like the old saying goes, a picture's worth 1,000 words. When it comes to court, it saves a lot of time on the stand trying to describe a scene. And again, it's subject to interpretation of what the member says. So it's nice that we can play the videotape in the courtroom, and this is exactly the way we found it, and no questions asked. And the plan was we were to return the videotape as much evidence as possible, return to the dock, unload the camera, take it back to the South Simcoe Police Service office where the tape was to be reviewed prior to disturbing the scene. That would allow us that if there was any area that they wanted focused, that we could return and everything was untouched, we can go back down and videotape it. Plus, it would allow the silt to settle from the initial videotaping.
Then we, together, the investigators, the divers, and the forensic identification people, we sat down and viewed the video and came up with a game plan on how we were going to proceed. So I got a good look at the watered scene. And what was unique about this is that the lake bottom was purely sand. And there was no vegetation, there were no rocks. And then suddenly there's this patio stone. There was no algae on it, there was no buildup of anything at all. It seemed obviously out of place.
Until everyone is satisfied that the videotape has accurately captured the scene, the evidence remains untouched. Then the divers begin the recovery.
The victim was removed from the bottom 35 feet down. We lowered a cage, Stokes cage basket next to the body. She was placed into the Stokes, and the divers assisted raising the body.
In this case, she was brought up with bags on her hands and over her head in the Stokes basket, and she was put into a funeral body bag once she got to the surface. And then that way the coroner could view her pronounced death, and then she was put in the body bag.
Once the body is in the boat, the team notices signs of trauma on Jan's forehead. Could it have been caused by foul play?
Could it have come from the canoe? Could it have come from the paddle? Could it have come from the ice? You know, we just weren't sure.
The victim is transported to the morgue. The patio stone and other evidence are taken to the forensic identification lab for testing.
I asked the divers to go back and take several water samples from the lake, from the surface of the lake, mid-level, and from the bottom of the lake as well. Diatoms are small microscopic organisms that are unique to each body of water.
If the autopsy finds that Jan died by drowning, the diatoms from the water samples will be compared to diatoms found in her tissue samples. If they match, it will prove that Jan drowned in Lake Simcoe.
Those are important in drowning deaths to help us determine ensure that the water the body is found in is the water that they were drowned in.
The next day, the divers return and videotape a larger area around the scene to make sure they did not miss anything that could be used as evidence. They make a few more discoveries.
There was a hiking-style backpack, which was large enough to accommodate the patio stone. There was one female shoe. There was a bungee cord, and I believe that was it.
The divers are satisfied that they have recovered all the evidence from Lake Simcoe. Now it's up to the investigative team to piece it all together. Suspicions are high around the circumstances of Jan Marshall's death. The evidence collected is pointing toward a cover-up. Will the autopsy uncover evidence that turns this canoeing accident into a homicide? Winston Malcolm has survived frigid waters in a canoe accident on Lake Simcoe, Ontario. Jan Marshall, his common-law wife, has suffered a different fate. Jan's body has been found in the lake along with a cement stone and a backpack. Detective Sergeant Tom McDonald is responsible for delivering the tragic news to Winston. Mr. Malcolm's reaction is rather unemotional.
I think he asked if they recovered the canoe, if I'm not mistaken. I believe that's what he asked.
As the detectives leave Winston's house, something catches their attention.
Detective Buchanan observed a location on his walkway where a patio stone had been freshly lifted. It left an impression in the ground, the same approximate size of the patio stone.
So obviously, that connection, although we still had to prove the patio stone came from his residence, that was certainly enough to raise our suspicions.
The investigators must resist jumping to conclusions and focus on building a strong case.
Post-mortem hadn't been done yet, so we still didn't know the cause of death. The fact that Mr. Malcolm had told the police officer who went to the hospital Thursday night that Jan was wearing big rubber boots, and the next day he had told Tom McDonald that she was wearing small shoes to find her shoeless in the water certainly caused us some concern as well. And of course, we'd also known at that point in time that Jan had told Winston that she wasn't happy and that she was going to end the relationship. And she told family members that she planned on leaving by the end of May.
As the events unfolded, we discovered rather quickly that the story that Mr. Malcolm had provided was crumbling. Nothing he said was consistent with what we discovered to be the truth.
Investigators believe there is sufficient evidence to arrest Winston.
Now remember, our grounds to arrest don't have to be to the extent that we could convict in court. We just have to have reasonable probable grounds to believe that he committed the offense. And so we can arrest on a weaker level of proof than we'd need to convict him in court. It was our belief that she'd been killed in the home and transported from the home to Lake Simcoe, where her body was disposed of, and that in pushing the body overside, canoe is not a very stable vessel to be putting anything large in and throwing it overboard. And we theorized that in the action of throwing her overboard, he capsized the canoe. But our fear was that Mr. Malcolm was certainly a wise man and would know that we were probably theorizing what had taken place, and we were afraid he's going to destroy evidence. So our thoughts were to arrest him, place him in custody, get our search warrant, knowing that we've protected our evidence now. We seized the scene, secured the scene to make sure nobody could tamper with anything, and put our search warrant together.
On Sunday, April 28th, 3 days after the alleged accident, Detective Sergeant Tom McDonald arrests Winston Malcolm for the first-degree murder of Jan Marshall.
Mr. Malcolm's demeanor at the time was fairly quiet. He was passive and showed little emotion.
On Monday, the pathologist begins the autopsy of the victim. Forensic Identification Officer Scott McLeod is present.
The autopsy was held in Toronto at the coroner's building. My job would be to record the autopsy, so I would take still photographs at that time and collect any evidence that was recovered from her, including all her clothing. Her body was in good condition. There was no decomposition. The water was like being in the bathtub too long. Hands were a little wrinkled, but she was in good condition.
There was obvious signs of trauma and bruising to the neck area, which caused some bruising to the trachea and the hyoid area. She had been manually strangled, which caused the bruising and the petechial hemorrhaging. Strangled to the point that she was rendered unconscious, but not deceased. And then the lake finished the job. The pathologist, Dr. Sepp, believed that death was due to drowning. She was not dead when she entered the water. And that she had suffered petechial hemorrhaging to both eyelids and eyes.
The autopsy reveals that Jan's death is due to more than just a canoeing accident. Did Winston accidentally strangle Jan during a fight? Did he panic when he thought he had killed her and threw her into the lake to hide her body? Or did he plan all along to render her unconscious and dump her body in Lake Simcoe to make it look like an accidental drowning?
In addition to the standard post-mortem, there was a diatom test that was performed by the coroner to indicate in which body of water Jan had died.
The results conclude that Jan did indeed drown in Lake Simcoe. Deep bruising found on her left shoulder blade is consistent with injuries that could have been made by dragging the body by the arms. The investigators want to determine how long the victim was unconscious before she took her last breath beneath the surface of Lake Simcoe. To determine when the assault occurred, the coroner orders a brain scan.
If she'd been unconscious for an extended period of time, usually 6, 8, 9 hours, at least somewhere in that range. That may be shown in those brain slides, which would then give us an indication on how long maybe before her body was deposited, because we knew for 5 hours that she was in that canoe, probably unconscious. So how long before 11 a.m. Had the altercation taken place where she was rendered unconscious? So that would help us narrow down the time of the event and help us focus on gathering evidence there. So he did take slides of the brain, and they were sent away, but they came back inconclusive.
The brain scan was inconclusive, but the results from the post-mortem provide police with even more evidence to support their theory and charges.
Back in the mid-90s, the law was a lot different back then. However, a warrant to arrest, a police officer can arrest a person on reasonable probable grounds that they've committed an indictable offense, which we certainly had at that point in time. Grounds for search are an awful lot more onerous in that we have to be able to identify what crime has taken place, where it may have taken place, what evidence we hope to find in the place we want to search, and we have to be specific.
Police then proceed to search the home of Jan and Winston.
My focus is first on recording the scene without disrupting anything. Second, I'm then looking for anything that may be on the warrant while I'm doing my photography or my videography. That's pretty well where my focus is the whole time I'm there. I don't tend to think of how people lived or why items may be in the house or not. My focus is on whether it may be relevant to the investigation. There are times when you may find something on the premise that's not listed on the warrant. If it's relevant to your case, you can seize it. It just has to be brought before a justice after the search warrant has been completed, and the seizure has to be justified. If the justice is satisfied with that, then you've legally obtained that item.
One such object is an empty bottle of tranquilizers. Is this a relevant factor in the investigation? Once filming and photographing are complete, the forensic identification technician draws a map of the home.
In this case, we did. It was a two-story brick and aluminum home, and we did a scale diagram of the main, well, all 3 floors, the main floor, the bedroom floor, and the basement.
Based on evidence found at the crime scene, Scott McLeod makes a special effort to look for corroborating evidence.
She was found with a section of yellow nylon rope loosely attached to her. So we would be interested to know whether there's any yellow nylon rope somewhere on the house premises. Very close by to her, on the bottom of the lake, was a patio stone. near the rear of the house. The very last position where a patio stone should have been, there was a stone missing.
So we made a plaster cast of that so that we could show definitively that that patio stone was taken from that spot outside Mr. Malcolm's home.
There was a car. It was fairly close to the steps leading into the house. After it was photographed, we took tapings from within the car. And what a taping is merely taking normal Scotch tape, wrapping it around your hand and touching the back of, for instance, the back of the car seat. And then we'll do several of those from within the car. We also took tapings from the trunk of the car. Once that was done, we actually took the trunk liner as a piece of evidence. Both of them shared that vehicle, so to find a hair in the trunk would not have been overly significant. Finding a broken hair or a hair with a root may have been a little more significant. A little more weight could have been put on it as to how the hair would have removed from her head.
McLeod hopes to find proof that Winston moved Jan's bruised and unconscious body to the lake in the trunk of the car.
Reports from the Center for Forensic Sciences showed that there were microscopically similar fibers on her clothing as were found in the trunk liner. The working theory was that that's how she was transported to the lake, and that's why we took the trunk liner to see whether there was hair and fibers that would match her clothing and vice versa.
10 days later, Winston's red canoe is recovered. Hopefully, it will reveal more clues about the tragic circumstances of Jan Marshall's death. The body of Jan Marshall is found in Lake Simcoe, Ontario. Her husband, Winston Malcolm, claims his wife capsized the canoe, throwing them both into the frigid water. Witness statements contradict Winston's story. After the discovery of important evidence, they arrest him for the murder of his wife. The canoe, which had drifted away, has just been found.
The canoe was red in color, and it was located in Big Bay Point, approximately 4 or 5 miles from the location. So we had put out alerts through the media indicating that we were looking for this canoe, and a cottager had actually found it.
I ended up going to the Innisfil Police Service and took general photographs of the recovered canoe. I did examine the inside to see whether there'd be any major scratches or something that couldn't be explained through normal use, and I didn't find anything.
The investigation draws to a close, except for one final search, which proves to be revealing.
We did a search warrant on the hospital and seized the medical records, and it was located there that he had an highly elevated level of a certain prescription drug in his system, which was way beyond therapeutic range.
In a statement made to his lawyer, Winston said he had ingested 30 tablets of clonazepam in an attempt to take his own life. Investigators try to put together the series of events that took place April 25th, 1996.
We believe that he thought he'd killed her. There was indications that after the violent act in the house, that he took a large number of prescription pills in an attempt to take his own life. That obviously didn't work. And then he decided that he had to find something to do with the body. And he came up with the canoe and disposing the body in the lake. And I think his story was going to be that she had planning to leave. She had indeed left, and he hasn't seen or heard of her. And when he capsized, I think the plan went awry. When he first put in, the witnesses tell us the ice floe was 30 to 40 feet offshore, and by 4 p.m. it was close to 300 yards offshore. So we theorized that he was waiting for water to be deep enough that he could dispose of the body safely. Our theory was that she was in the sleeping bag, and that helped him hide the body from sight, and that the patio stone and rope were tied to her in the sleeping bag, and that when he threw her overboard, her body came out of the sleeping bag, and the sleeping bag remained on the surface, and her body sunk to the bottom with the stone. Those nylon ropes aren't really good at holding a knot, and so we theorized that the patio stone, probably the knot came undone and the cord came off the patio stone and just hung there in her belt loop.
Investigators have everything they need to prepare for trial.
Well, the next stage in the investigation, of course, is the coordination of all the statements and evidence that you have acquired and getting the accused properly before the courts. A preliminary hearing was scheduled shortly thereafter. It lasted approximately 3 weeks.
We provide the Crown with our investigation, and we went through it with them. We explained the evidence we had, the key witnesses. We gave them a copy of our entire investigative brief, and it's kind of a way for the defense also to see just what the evidence is. Of course, we make full disclosure, but they also get to see just how good the witnesses are, and for the Crown to also choose and make sure that the witnesses and the evidence are solid. But it's mostly for the judge to determine that, yes, this is the right charge, they have the evidence to support it, and this trial is worthy to go on to a full trial. We thought we had a good case for first, but first is very difficult to prove, obviously, in situations like this. But he would have had to explain. I believe personally that he would have had to have taken the stand to explain the contradictory statements he made to witnesses and the police. So I think that would have been a tough one for him to get over.
Winston pleads guilty to second-degree murder. His lawyer knows the prosecution cannot prove premeditation, which is essential for a first-degree murder charge.
We believed that at that time, with the information that we had, that it was planned and deliberate. However, we know that unfortunate domestic situations sometimes can get out of hand. Ms. Marshall had a bruising on the forehead. We believe she was hit with something. And there was some blunt trauma to the forehead, a manual strangulation. There were other bruising to her elbows. So there were signs of a struggle or signs of violence, not unlike a domestic situation or a physical altercation.
On April 10, 1997, Winston Malcolm is convicted of the second-degree murder of Jan Marshall. He receives a 25-year sentence and is eligible for parole after having served a minimum of 10 years in a penitentiary. The investigating team is satisfied with the sentence.
The role that water played in this investigation was, unfortunately, a means of disposing of a body. Ultimately, the cause of death for Jan was drowning. So it played a very big part in her demise.
It struck me in that the water killed Jan, yet that wasn't the intent of Winston. His intent was to use the water, as it so often is, to hide a crime or to cover a crime. And it actually helped him commit the crime. He thought he'd killed her, and he hadn't. And so the water did the job for him.
We may never know for sure if Winston Malcolm intended to kill Jan Marshall. But one thing is certain. The waters of Lake Simcoe ultimately served as the perfect murder weapon.